I looked at the sheriff, then back at the woman wearing the HOA president's badge. She pointed at me like I was a criminal. "You don't belong here," she said. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I wasn't standing on someone else's property. I was standing on my own private 100-acre island. Or at least, I thought I was. Because while I'd been working overseas for 3 years, someone had transformed my island into a luxury subdivision. 25 brand new homes. Perfectly paved roads. Street lights. A clubhouse. Families living their everyday lives. All built on land my grandfather bought more than 75 years ago. The worst part? The HOA had no idea who I was. They handed me thousands of dollars in fines, threatened to tow my truck, and ordered me to leave my own property before sunset. What they didn't know was that sitting inside my old leather briefcase was the one document that would destroy everything they had built. One original deed. One family record. And one courtroom battle that would expose a fraud worth millions of dollars. This is the unbelievable story of how an entire HOA built 25 homes on my private island, and how they learned, far too late, that they had picked the wrong landowner to challenge. 3 years earlier. Life looked very different. My grandfather, William Harper, bought this island in 1948. People thought he was crazy. There was no electricity. No roads. No buildings. Just towering cedar trees, rocky beaches, and a quiet place where he dreamed our family would always have a home. He built a small fishing cabin with his own hands. Every summer, my father and I would come here before sunrise. We'd fish from the dock until breakfast. Spend afternoons hiking through the woods. And end every day sitting beside a crackling fire while my grandfather told stories that somehow always ended with the same sentence. Land isn't something you borrow. You protect it. At the time, I thought he was just talking about property. Years later, I realized he was talking about family. When I was offered a construction management job overseas, it felt like the opportunity of a lifetime. 3 years away. Excellent pay. Enough money to finally renovate the old cabin and retire early. Before leaving, I hired an old family friend named Mike to check on the island every month. He promised he'd keep an eye on everything. For the first year. He did. He sent photos. Called every few weeks. Everything looked exactly the way I'd left it. Then, the calls stopped. I assumed he was busy. What I didn't know was that Mike had suffered a heart attack and quietly retired. For nearly 18 months. No one visited Harper Island. And while I was halfway around the world, someone else made plans for my family's future. 3 years later, I finally came home. The first thing I noticed wasn't the marina. It wasn't the boats. It was the sign. A massive stone entrance sign that read, "Welcome to Emerald Shores Estates. Private HOA community." I actually laughed. There had to be some mistake. There was no Emerald Shores. There never had been. There was only Harper Island. I walked over to the ferry captain. "I think you've got the wrong island." He looked at me with genuine confusion. "You own that place?" "I've owned it my whole life." He stared toward the water. "I don't think the people living over there know that." My stomach dropped. "What people?" He looked back at me. "There are about 25 families living there now." As the ferry rounded the eastern shoreline, I walked to the front of the boat. At first, I thought we were approaching the wrong island. The dense cedar forest had vanished. In its place stood rows of beautiful luxury homes stretching across the hillside. Freshly paved roads curved through the neighborhood. Streetlights lined every corner. Children laughed in a playground built exactly where my grandfather's favorite fishing pond had once been. A fountain sprayed into the air where we used to launch our canoe. The old cabin. Gone. The dock. Gone. Even the giant cedar tree my father planted when I was 10 years old. Gone. I stood there frozen. My backpack slipped from my shoulder and hit the deck with a thud. No one on the ferry said a word. The captain quietly looked at me. "I'm sorry." I couldn't answer. Because in that moment, I wasn't looking at a neighborhood. I was looking at the place where my childhood had been erased. The ferry hadn't even finished tying up at the dock before I stepped onto the pier. Everything felt wrong. The old wooden dock my grandfather and I rebuilt after every winter storm was gone. In its place was a brand new marina with polished aluminum railings and expensive yachts tied to floating docks. I started walking toward where the cabin should have been. Instead, a white security SUV came speeding toward me. It stopped just a few feet away. 2 uniformed security guards climbed out. Then the rear door opened. A woman in an expensive navy blue suit stepped onto the pavement. Perfect hair. Designer sunglasses. Leather portfolio tucked under one arm. She smiled politely. But it wasn't a friendly smile. "Good afternoon. I'm Beth Chambers, president of Emerald Shores Homeowners Association." She looked me up and down. "Can I help you?" I nodded. "I certainly hope so. I own this island." For a split second, she looked genuinely confused. Then she laughed. The guards laughed with her. "I'm sorry," she said. "You own what?" I pointed behind her. "Everything." Her smile disappeared. "I'm afraid you've been misinformed." "No," I replied quietly. "I think you have." Beth slowly opened her leather folder. She pulled out a bright yellow citation. Then handed it to me. I looked down. At first, I thought it had to be a joke. Across the top were the words: "Notice of HOA violation. Violation number 1. Trespassing. Violation number 2. Unauthorized vehicle. Violation number 3. Failure to register as a resident. Total amount due: $7,500. I couldn't help it. I laughed. "You just fined me for standing on my own property." Beth folded her arms. "This community has rules. You have 30 minutes to leave. If you refuse, the sheriff has already been notified." I slowly unzipped my backpack. Immediately, both security guards stiffened. Beth took one step backward. Instead of reaching for a weapon, I reached for an old leather document case. Inside, wrapped in protective plastic, was the original property deed. Yellow with age. Signed in blue ink. Recorded in 1948. I held it toward Beth. "You should probably read this." She didn't even look at it. "We don't recognize private paperwork." For the first time, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was going to become a war. The following morning, our survey crew returned to the island. For the first time, I wasn't alone. Andrea walked beside me carrying copies of the original 1948 survey. Behind us, 3 licensed surveyors unloaded thousands of dollars worth of equipment. If my grandfather's property lines still existed, we were about to find them. The following morning, our survey crew returned to the island. For the first time, I wasn't alone. Andrea walked beside me carrying copies of the original 1948 survey. Behind us, 3 licensed surveyors unloaded thousands of dollars worth of equipment. If my grandfather's property lines still existed, we were about to find them. Residents stopped what they were doing. Some paused while walking their dogs. Others stepped out onto their front porches. Within minutes, everyone was watching us. Nobody understood why a professional survey crew had suddenly arrived. One surveyor stopped near a perfectly landscaped flower bed. He checked the old map. Looked at his GPS. Then checked again. Finally, he smiled. "I think it's here." The crew carefully removed the decorative stones. Then the mulch. Then several inches of dirt. A few moments later, metal scraped against solid granite. Everyone froze. One surveyor brushed away decades of packed dirt. Letters slowly appeared. H. Then another. P. The initials stood for Harper Property. Exactly as they appeared on my grandfather's original survey. The stone had survived for nearly 80 years. Developers had paved roads, built homes, installed sidewalks. But somehow, they had never removed the one thing that proved exactly where the property began. Beth Chambers arrived only minutes later. She stepped out of her SUV. Her confident smile disappeared the instant she saw the granite monument. She walked closer. Read the engraving. Then looked at Andrea. No. Andrea nodded. Yes. Beth whispered almost to herself. This can't be happening. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. Local television stations interrupted their regular programming. Newspapers posted breaking news alerts. Within hours, satellite trucks lined the entrance to Emerald Shores Estates. The quiet neighborhood had become the center of the biggest property controversy the county had ever seen. The quiet entrance to Emerald Shores looked more like a movie premiere than a neighborhood. News cameras lined both sides of the boulevard. Neighbors stood in small groups, whispering to one another. Everyone wanted answers. Nobody seemed to have any. For years, people had believed they were living in one of the most desirable communities on the coast. Now, they were learning the land beneath their homes might never have belonged to the developer in the first place. An elderly homeowner slowly approached me. He looked nervous. "I've lived here almost 4 years. He hesitated. "My wife and I invested everything we had into this house." His voice cracked. "Are we going to lose our home?" I looked around at the families standing behind him. Children. Retirees. Young couples. None of them had created this situation. They were simply caught in it. I answered as honestly as I could. "I'm not here to take your home. I'm here to find out who ignored the truth." Word spread quickly. One by one, residents began pulling old closing documents out of filing cabinets. Mortgage folders appeared. Title insurance paperwork. Purchase contracts. People started comparing notes. The same question echoed across the neighborhood. How did no one catch this? Late that afternoon, Beth Chambers finally agreed to speak. She walked to a small podium outside the clubhouse. Television cameras immediately turned toward her. She forced a smile. "I want to assure every resident that this is simply an ongoing legal dispute." Questions flew from every direction. Did the HOA ever own the land? When did you first learn about Mr. Harper's claim? Did anyone verify ownership? Beth looked toward the cameras. Then, she simply said, "No further comments." She turned around and walked back inside. The silence that followed spoke louder than anything she could have said. As the sun disappeared behind the island, something changed. People stopped defending the HOA. They started asking questions. And for the first time, the board realized this wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. It had become public. And there was no hiding from it. 3 weeks later. The courthouse steps were packed before sunrise. Television crews. Residents. Lawyers. County officials. No one could remember a property dispute that had attracted this much attention. As Andrea and I walked toward the entrance, the crowd parted. Not because we were celebrities, but because everyone wanted to know the answer to one question. Who really owned Harper Island? Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. Every seat was taken. People lined the walls. Even the hallway outside overflowed with spectators. Across the room, Beth Chambers sat quietly beside the developer's legal team. Gone was the confidence she had shown the day she handed me that first violation notice. Today, she never looked up. Judge Eleanor Marshall entered the courtroom without saying a word. Everyone immediately stood. The room fell completely silent. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and slowly looked around the courtroom. This court will now hear the matter of Harper versus Emerald Shores Development Corporation. Her voice was calm. Steady. Almost emotionless. But everyone in the room knew. This case was unlike anything the county had ever seen. 25 families. An entire subdivision. And one man claiming he still owned every acre beneath it. Andrea stood first. She carried only one folder. No stack of binders. No dramatic display. Just one worn leather portfolio. She walked to the evidence table. Carefully opened the folder. Then removed a single sheet of yellowed paper. She held it up for the court. My client's grandfather recorded this deed in 1948. It has remained in the Harper family ever since. She placed it gently on the evidence table. The original. Not a copy. Not a reprint. The original document. Next. Andrea projected a survey map onto the courtroom screen. This map was recorded with the original deed. A second image appeared. The modern subdivision plan. She overlaid the two maps. The room leaned forward. Roads. Homes. The clubhouse. Every structure. Sat inside the original Harper property boundary. The only thing missing was a legal transfer of ownership. The developer's attorney rose quickly. Your Honor, we acknowledge there may have been historical discrepancies. Andrea interrupted. Historical discrepancies? She pressed a button on the courtroom monitor. A recovered company email filled the screen. Ownership concerns. Every eye in the courtroom locked onto the words. Andrea read aloud. Proceed with construction. If the owner ever appears, we'll settle later. Silence. The judge slowly looked toward the developer's executive team. So, you were aware there was an ownership dispute before construction was completed? No one answered. The judge turned toward the lead developer. You may answer. He adjusted his tie. Looked at his attorneys. Then down at the table. Finally, he spoke. We believe the issue would be resolved before it became necessary. Andrea didn't hesitate. So your company knowingly continued construction while ownership remained unresolved? A long pause. Then. Yes. The courtroom erupted. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. The judge immediately struck her gavel. Order. But the damage had already been done. The admission hung in the air like a storm cloud. The judge turned toward the lead developer. You may answer. He adjusted his tie. Looked at his attorneys. Then down at the table. Finally, he spoke. We believe the issue would be resolved before it became necessary. Andrea didn't hesitate. So your company knowingly continued construction while ownership remained unresolved? A long pause. Then. Yes. The courtroom erupted. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. The judge immediately struck her gavel. Order. But the damage had already been done. The admission hung in the air like a storm cloud. Judge Marshall picked up the original deed. She examined the signatures. The county recording stamp. The property description. Then she looked toward the developer's attorneys. I have reviewed the evidence submitted by both parties. Her voice was calm. But everyone in the courtroom was listening. She continued. The evidence before this court establishes that the Harper family maintained recorded ownership of the subject property. My heart started pounding. Then came the words I had been waiting months to hear. The court finds that the plaintiff has established lawful ownership of the disputed property. I closed my eyes. Andrea put her hand on my shoulder. The judge continued. The Emerald Shores Homeowners Association is not the recorded owner of the land. A wave of whispers moved through the courtroom. Beth Chambers stared straight ahead. Then came the final part. The developer and associated parties may not continue to exercise ownership rights over property they do not legally own. The gavel struck. Once. Twice. The courtroom erupted. But then something unexpected happened. The judge turned toward the homeowners. She made it clear that the residents themselves were not the people responsible for what had happened. They had purchased their homes believing the developer had done everything legally. They had signed contracts, obtained mortgages, paid their taxes, trusted professionals. They were victims too. That mattered to me. Because I never wanted revenge against the families living there. I wanted accountability for the people who had knowingly built on land that wasn't theirs. When I stepped outside, the sunlight almost felt different. Reporters surrounded me. Microphones appeared from every direction. Mr. Harper. Are you going to force the homeowners out? What happens to the 25 houses? I waited for the noise to settle. Then I answered. No. I'm not interested in destroying families. I'm interested in making sure the people responsible answer for what they did. The 25 homes remained. For the time being. The residents were allowed to stay while the parties worked through the legal and financial consequences. Some residents eventually pursued settlements. Others explored long-term arrangements. The details took months to resolve. But one thing was finally clear. Nobody could pretend the land didn't have an owner anymore. A few months later, I returned to the island alone. No lawyers. No reporters. No security guards. Just me. For the first time in years. It was quiet. I walked through the trees toward the place where my grandfather's cabin had stood. And when I reached the clearing, I stopped. The cabin was gone. All that remained was the stone fireplace. I placed my hand against the old stone. And suddenly, I could remember everything. My grandfather carrying rocks up from the shoreline. My father splitting firewood. My younger self sitting beside the fireplace listening to stories. Then I remembered his final warning. Land is the one thing they can't make more of. He was right. But there was something else he had taught me. Land isn't valuable because of what you can build on it. It's valuable because of what it means to the people who came before you. I decided the island wasn't going to become another development. Not while I was alive. The restoration began slowly. Damaged areas were replanted. The shoreline was repaired. Old construction debris was removed. Trails were reopened. And thousands of native trees were planted. Every tree felt like a small victory. One of the first things I rebuilt was the dock. Not because I needed it, but because my grandfather had built the original one himself. I wanted the next generation of my family to stand in the same place and see the same water. One afternoon, several of the former homeowners came to see me. I wasn't sure why. They stood near the shoreline carrying something wrapped in brown paper. An older man stepped forward. "We know none of this was your fault." Then he handed me the package. I opened it. Inside was a wooden plaque. It read, "Harper Point. Dedicated to the family who protected this island for future generations." I couldn't speak. The people who had unknowingly become part of the nightmare were thanking me for protecting the place they had once believed belonged to someone else. I looked at them, then smiled. "Thank you." That was all I could say. That evening, I went back to the house. I opened the old leather document case. Inside was my grandfather's original deed. The same piece of paper that had survived nearly 80 years. I carefully placed it inside a fireproof safe. Not because I expected another fight, but because I'd learned something. Some things are worth protecting, even when you think you'll never need them. Today, when I stand on the western shore at sunset, the island feels like itself again. The forest is growing. The wildlife has returned. The water is quiet. And the old dock stretches out across the same bay where my grandfather taught me to fish. Sometimes I stand there alone. And I think about how close I came to losing everything. Not because I sold it. Not because I abandoned it. But because someone else decided they could simply take it. And every time the sun disappears behind the trees, I hear my grandfather's voice. "Take care of this island, Danny." For years, I thought that meant protecting the land. Now I understand. He was really telling me to protect the story. Our family. Our memories. And the promise that one generation makes to the next. Because buildings can be torn down. Companies can disappear. HOAs can collapse. But one honest deed, one family, and one promise can survive almost anything. I promised my grandfather I'd take care of this island. And this time, I kept my promise. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, please like, subscribe and please leave me a comment where you're watching from.